Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Synergy Update session. My name is Tyson Harris, and I'm an account manager here at Synergex. And I'm joined by our presenter, Synergex Senior Consultant, Steve Ives. Steve has worked as a technical consultant and trainer for Synergex since 1997. Developing e-commerce applications and helping companies maximize their vertical market software applications. Steve has experience with networking, building, and managing internet connections and with security firewall solutions. He is proficient in several programming languages and has been involved in the development of internet and intranet business software applications. So after Steve's short presentation, there will be some time for Q&A with an opportunity to use your microphones and cameras if you wish. In the meantime, if you guys have any questions or comments about anything, feel free to post questions to the Q&A section or to the chat area. If you have any technical issues during the session or at any time during the conference, you can contact classes@synergex.com. And the email, we can post that in the chat as well. And also, just for everyone's information, this session is being recorded as well. So thank you, and please enjoy Steve's presentation.
Hello, and welcome to this Synergy Update presentation as part of the DevPartner 2022 event. As usual in this slot, I will review recent Synergy developments and provide information about changes you're likely to see in the coming months and years. I will begin with a brief roundup of some of the procedural changes that we've made since DevPartner 2021, and I will also summarize some of the changes that have been made in the Synergy DE Visual Studio integration and Harmony Core products. Later, I will tell you about some of the exciting things that we have planned for future releases. Some of these are things that our development teams are already working on and that you will start to see being delivered soon in upcoming Synergy 12.2 feature releases. As you may know, as well as being more agile in our development, we're also being more agile in our planning process. It's a little early to tell you exactly what will be included in the next LTS release, but we do know the timeframe for the 12.3 LTS release will be late 2023, after the release of .NET. Let's get started. First, I would like to talk about recent changes in the release procedures that are now implemented for the Synergy DE products. As is common in the industry, we've switched to a release strategy involving major long-term support, or LTS releases, that have a known release cadence of approximately 2 years and a known support window of at least 4 years. Despite being a few months late with our first LTS release, our plan is still to release LTS releases towards the end of each odd-numbered year, and because of the many dependencies on Microsoft's .NET products, which also produces LTS releases on a 2-year cadence, typically in November. It's likely that our STE LTS releases will be in the last few weeks of the year. Remember that LTS releases have odd minor version numbers, so 12.1, 12.3, and so on, and that once released, no new features will be added to the release. There may be subsequent releases to fix issues or address security requirements, but with those exceptions, LTS releases are designed to provide highly stable environments for extended periods of time. In addition to LTS releases, there are also feature releases. A series of feature releases will occur between each LTS release, each including features that have recently been completed. The list of additional features will grow with each subsequent feature release in the series, and eventually the complete set of features will form the new feature set of the next LTS release. The cadence of feature releases will be determined by when each new feature is completed, and the support window of a feature release is much shorter than for an LTS release. I do want to stress, though, that feature releases are not beta releases. They are thoroughly tested and qualified to the best of our ability and are approved for use in all development and deployment scenarios. By the way, feature releases are labeled with even minor version numbers, so 12.0, 12.2, and so on. Some of you may also have noticed that from version 12, we no longer use patch letters. Like most of the industry, we now use build numbers, which will reset to 1000 with the first release in a new feature release series, and continue across into the LTS release that follows the feature release series. Oh, and there are no more hotfix zip files either. In the rare case that you may find a problem that requires an emergency fix, we will now ship you that fix in the form of a full installation for the product that can be installed in the normal way. Before we get into more detail about features, let's quickly review the current releases. The latest release of Synergy DE is 12.1.1, build 3282. Released earlier this month, this is the first update to the 12.1 LTS release. I think this reinforces the fact that LTS releases are highly stable, as the first update was almost a full 6 months after the initial 12.1 release. Enhancements to the Synergy DBL integration for Visual Studio, or SDI as we tend to refer to it, continue to come thick and fast, with the latest release being 2022.08, build 1287. This represents the 10th SDI release of the year. Also, for those of you who haven't made it to version 12 yet, we recently ported some of the 12.1 quality enhancements back to version 11 and released 11.1.1J for all platforms in late August. As for upcoming releases, no dates yet, but our development team is working on several new features that will become part of the first 12.2 feature release in due course. Next, I'd like to review some of the more significant enhancements that were introduced in versions 11 and 12. Let's start with version 11. Arguably, one of the most significant features in Synergy 11 was the introduction of resilient ISAM files. Having marked an ISAM file as resilient during creation, any index corruption that may occur on that file that is detected can be corrected using a new option to the ISUtil utility. And most importantly, this is an operation that can be completed without requiring exclusive access to the file. In other words, correcting file corruption in resilient ISAM files is an operation that can now be completed while the file is in use by other users and without the need to take the application down. And further, if XF Server is running on the system, on the default port, you can configure the system such that if an index corruption is detected in a resilient file, XF Server will automatically step in and re-index the file. You don't have to be using XF Server to access the file, it just has to be running. In addition to resilient ISAM files, also a second protection level called full resilient does everything resilient does, but also causes all store, write, and delete operations to be written through caches all the way to the disk. This can help resilience in the case where your storage subsystem may not have resilient functionality such as battery backup and so on. While we're talking about file corruption, recent work with several Synergy customers has helped us understand that while file corruption can and does occur because of crashing programs or systems, most corruptions appear to happen because administrators kill processes. So if you do suffer from corruption problems, please stop doing that. Still ISAM recovery related, in addition to rebuilding indexes on the fly, we were also able to achieve significant performance improvements when doing so. Given the right environment, it's possible that rebuilds can be completed up to 10 times faster than before. In one specific example with a real customer file that was 20 gigabytes in size, the index rebuild time was reduced from 40 minutes to just 5. A lot of focus is on .NET these days, but we are always on the lookout for ways to enhance traditional Synergy as well, and several things were added in version 11. We added full support for ternary operators, as well as new null conditional and null coalescing operators. We also enhanced the traditional Synergy string class, adding several new methods, including isNull_Empty, trim, remove, insert, and concat. We also added a new string builder class, providing an efficient way to dynamically build new string objects. We added extension method support to traditional Synergy, and the HTTP API also received some attention, adding support for additional methods such as head and patch, and also support for an HTTP transfer mechanism called chunked encoding. These changes ensure that Synergy applications can fully interact with the latest RESTful web service APIs, as well as other things. We also added support for base64 encoding and decoding with a new data encoding class. Again, this capability is a fundamental requirement when interacting with many web service APIs. In the Windows world, we improved our support for high DPI monitors in the low-level windowing routines and also in UI Toolkit. These changes not only result in better sizing of UI elements, but also updates the look and feel of your application's windows to a more modern style. A new global I/O hooks mechanism enables you to add I/O hooks to channels within an application without making any changes to your existing code. You simply add an external subroutine named syn global hooks open to your environment, and it gets called every time a successful open statement executes. All that remains is to add code to that routine to add the I/O hooks to your channel as necessary. In the SQL Connection API, support was added for the MySQL database version 8 on Windows and 64-bit Linux systems. Synergy 11 also enforced the requirement to use the recently introduced Rev 11 licensing environment. Rev 11 licensing revolves around cloud-based web services that are used to distribute license keys to systems running Synergy applications. Rev 11 is simplifying the license management process for many of our customers, and indeed for Synergex. And then came Synergy 12, our first LTS release, 12.1. To properly understand the driving forces behind Synergy 12, we need to look back at what Microsoft has been doing over the last few years. In April 2019, Microsoft released the .NET Framework version 4.8, having previously announced that it would be the last version of that product. And while monthly security and reliability bug fixes have and will continue to be released, no further changes are planned. Of course, for several years prior, they'd been working on a replacement called .NET Core, which had made it all the way through .NET Core version 3.1 before being renamed simply .NET. Anyone confused yet? Skipping version 4, I assume they thought that having .NET Framework 4 and .NET 4 was just too confusing. Yeah. They announced that .NET 5 would be API complete. This doesn't mean it will never change. It means that all of the APIs that were going to be brought over from .NET Framework had been. But .NET 5 was not an LTS release, and its use was somewhat limited to early adopters. Then in November 2021, .NET 6 was released as the first long-term support release of the new .NET platform. And it is .NET 6 that we had been planning all along on targeting as our initial supported version. Synergy 12, therefore, represents the culmination of almost 2 years of work to add support for .NET 6 as an alternative to .NET Framework in the many places where Synergy and .NET touch. This was a significant development effort that required work in many areas of the Synergy products. So, as Synergy developers decide to pull the trigger on migrating their .NET Framework applications to .NET or start creating new .NET applications, they're now able to incorporate their Synergy.NET code into those solutions. And of course, in addition to the generally superior performance compared to .NET Framework, .NET applications can also be deployed on platforms other than Windows, for example, Linux. More on that later. In addition to adding support for .NET 6, we've also created and released a new XFNetlink.NET client that is built with .NET Standard 2.0. Meaning that it can be used from .NET Framework, .NET Core 3.1, and .NET applications. It's distributed via NuGet. And for those who use component pooling in their applications and previously used COM+ pooling, which is a Windows-only technology, we also developed and included an all-new pooling mechanism, which is very similar to that used in XFNetlink Java connection pooling. The new mechanism spins up and manages a pool of objects within your application. So it does require a little bit of work to implement, but in turn dispenses with all of the onerous management overhead that COM+ pooling requires. Another significant change and enhancement in Synergy 12 is the swapping out of the encryption technologies used throughout the product set on Windows, where OpenSSL is no longer used. replaced by the Windows S channel or secure channel, part of the Windows operating system. This change not only reduces development and deployment requirements, as it's no longer necessary to provide OpenSSL, but also improves several aspects of using encryption. I'm not going to get into more detail here, but instead I'll refer you to the documentation, as well as to several recent blog posts that I made on the subject. Related to the encryption changes on Windows, there were also some changes to the OpenSSL certificate validation that could have an impact on all platforms except OpenVMS. If you're using encryption in any of the Synergy products, I strongly suggest that you review the documentation as well as those blog posts that I mentioned before upgrading to Synergy 12. Let's briefly talk about data access, and in particular, a new feature added to the select classes. We added a group by class that allows grouping a selection in either ascending or descending order after the entire selection has been made. There is also a no case group by version to allow ignoring case when performing group by operations. You can achieve multiple levels of grouping by combining group by expressions with AND operators. And for those of you using XF Server to access remote data, there's also a new feature that some have been requesting for some time. You now have the ability to connect to multiple XF Server instances, perhaps on different systems, at the same time. This is done by utilizing new routines, create server connection and destroy server connection, to independently manage server connections, and a new open statement option server connection that allows you to specify the server connection to be used for the new channel that you're opening. Moving on to a Linux-specific feature, license forwarding. Previously, every Linux instance running Synergy software would have to be individually licensed with product license keys assigned specifically to that system. In Synergy 12, during license initialization in the installation, you have the option to connect to, connect the license in Linux instance to a Windows-based Synergy license server and share the product keys installed on that server with all other Windows and Linux systems attached to that server. This is a feature that's useful in many different scenarios, including production environments where using a backup license server could now help you improve high availability in Linux environments and give you additional disaster recovery capabilities. And this is particularly great for Linux developers who can now use the license server on their Windows development PC to license any number of Linux instances, including VMs and WSL2 instances and so on. Work on the SDI product is continually an ongoing process, and there have been many releases since the last conference. One change that SDI is that SDI now has its own development and release cadence. So releases are usually no longer tied to specific SDE releases and come on a much more frequent basis. SDI is also not included in the LTS release program. So many SDI releases contain new features in addition to quality improvements. The items listed on this slide are just a sample of some of the more notable things that have changed in SDI recently. I'm not going to read out all of them, but I will call out a small number of the more notable ones. We have made significant improvements to solution load performance, so important to many customers who have hundreds or even thousands, in some cases, of projects in their solutions. Also adding support for filtered solution load, which allows you to open a solution without opening all of the projects in the solution and then selectively loading projects as you need to access them, is incredibly useful. Another area we frequently pay attention to is the performance of the dependency build system. And I'm happy to report that the team has made some big steps forward in that area also. Support for building Synergy projects in parallel was a big part of the solution, and we also made some significant improvements in build times for multi-mainline projects in some scenarios. We were also able to rework the repository schema loading mechanism so that it is now able to deal with correctly loading a repository from multiple schema files when dependencies exist between those entities, without you needing to artificially control the load order of things via file naming conventions and so on. And two very significant enhancements to SDI were the addition of a traditional Synergy unit testing project template, as well as a new project template allowing UI Toolkit developers to compile their Windows script files into window libraries, as they were able to do in Workbench. Regarding the versions of Visual Studio that we support, our primary focus is on Visual Studio 2022, which, by the way, is required for any and all .NET 6 development. And it's our policy, as is our policy, we still do support the previous major version of Visual Studio. At the current time, that's Visual Studio 2019. But we do require a minimum version of 16.11 of that product. By the way, that minimum requirement did increase recently. Until recently, it was 16.9. It's becoming quite difficult to maintain support for both versions, likely because of the significant differences between the two, the former being a 32-bit product and the latter being a 64-bit product. While we have no intention of dropping support early for 2019, it may become necessary to begin distributing enhancements only in the 2022 version in the future. At this time, we encourage upgrading to Visual Studio 2022 so long as your system supports it. This is a product update presentation, and I would be remiss not to mention Harmony Core, but I will do so only very briefly because I don't want to steal any thunder from Jeff Green's presentation right after this one. Harmony Core continues to gain momentum and has become an important foundation technology for many customers. The most recent significant change has been a migration from .NET Core 3.1 to .NET 6, and the creation of NuGet packages, CodeGen templates, and a new version of the Harmony Core CLI tool to assist with the upgrade process. Harmony Core 6 services benefit from significantly improved Swagger documentation, making exposed APIs easier to understand and consume, and the API documentation now includes information about traditional bridge endpoints in addition to the existing OData endpoints. We've also been working on enhancing the sample environments provided by the solution templates that new developers use to get started with Harmony Core development. Having completed our work to facilitate migration from XF Server Plus to REST via code generation from the Synergy method catalog, the solution provided by the Harmony demo template now includes a complete example of such an environment. By the way, the same technique, generating code based on method catalog definitions of an API, can also be used to accelerate development, even if you're not starting from an existing XF Server Plus codebase. Finally, I want to mention Linux support, which we've been promising for some time now. We are really close to that becoming a reality. We have most of the pieces in place, and at this time, we're just waiting for an upcoming Synergy 12.2 release to add support for Synergy.net on Linux platforms. This slide shows the current minimum operating system versions required to run the latest version of Synergy. I won't read through all of the information. You can each pick out the platforms that are important to you. I will point out, however, that Synergy 11.11i or higher is required to deploy to Windows 11 or Server 2022. This is not unusual. We always certify a minimum version at the time of release of any new operating system version, but in many cases, earlier versions will run just fine. But that is not necessarily the case here in most cases. If you have any Synergy Windows or UI Toolkit code, including using any of our utilities that have UI Toolkit UI, then you will almost certainly need to upgrade to 11.11i or higher to avoid some interesting visual effects in parts of the UI. By the way, you can thank Microsoft for that with some low-level UI changes late in the release cycle. For you OpenVMS developers out there, another thing to note is that we still have no final decision on whether Synergy will be ported to OpenVMS on x86. VSI has now released OpenVMS 9.2 for x86 in July and said it is production ready. Unfortunately, there are still no C and C++ compilers available. So like many other vendors, our hands are tied. Synergy customer demand for the x86 platform is also very low, with an overwhelming majority of our VMS customers telling us that they have no interest in the new platform. At the current time, this remains an unknown. No decision has been made either way. If you do still use OpenVMS and you think you may be interested in migrating to the x86 platform at some point in the future, then please make your Synergex account manager aware of that. Okay, enough about the past. Let's turn our attention to the future and tell you about some things that we're already working on and some things that we're planning to work on in the short to medium term. As is usual, for this type of presentation, I do need to prefix this by saying that some of the things that you will see here are not set in stone. The information presented here represents our current thinking, but things may change. I will also prefix this section by saying that the product team here at Synergex, of which I'm a part, is very invested in making decisions about product features based on what makes sense for our customers. If you have ideas about things that we could do in the Synergy products that would help you maintain and extend your Synergy applications, we definitely want to hear those ideas. As we work to identify specific features and enhancements that we can make to our products, there are several theme areas that are always in our mind. One message that we've heard loud and clear is that customers want anything we can do that helps them build systems that are highly available and can be efficiently recovered in the case of disaster. In many cases, this is Synergy ISAM related, making the SDMS layer as bulletproof as possible. We've been working on this theme constantly from Synergy 10, throughout Synergy 10 and 11, and that effort carries on into Synergy 12. Another topic that we're seeing coming up in many conversations with customers is that of cloud computing. That can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but we're working on some core technologies that we believe will be of great importance to customers moving forwards. These topics include containerization and deployment to environments such as Kubernetes clusters. Clearly, those are topics that also bridge across into the HA and DR themes. Implementing new ways to easily and efficiently access data is also important to our customers. The select classes continue to grow in features and functionality, as do products such as Harmony Core and its entity framework provider, that can even be used to achieve some transactional capabilities with underlying Synergy data. Just not quite full ACID yet. We're also constantly looking for new ways to make it easier to run your existing DBL code in .NET. And that includes a continual focus on making the developer's experience in Visual Studio as effective and productive as possible for all types of Synergy development. One area that we're intending to focus on in the near future is improving the developer's quality of life when working with the repository. We've already taken several initial steps in this area, but we think there are some more things that can be done to simplify the development process when repository is involved. And finally, as we have been for the last 2 years or so, we're still engaged in reimagining and modernizing our own internal development. I think it's fair to say that we're getting towards the end of that journey now, but there are still some things that remain to be done. To drill into the topic of high availability for a moment, as already mentioned, some big steps have already been taken in this area with the introduction of things like resilient ISAM files and the recovery of ISAM index corruption while files are in use, and even automated using XF Server as a recovery server. But we think we can do more in this area by whittling away at some of the things that require application downtime. In particular, we'd like to make it possible to add and remove ISAM keys while a file is in use, and even perhaps extend the record length of a file while it's in use. Also, as mentioned earlier, we want to help customers avoid file corruption in the first place by recognizing that in some cases, corruption is caused by specific actions taken by administrators, users, and in some cases, even programmed functionality in utility software. Many file corruptions occur as a result of intentional process termination, and there are strategies that can be adopted to minimize or even completely remove the necessity to do so. This might not manifest as product changes in Synergy, but more likely be a solution reached through an educational process. For some time, the select classes have included the ability to order and group data, but these operations can't currently be combined with joins between tables. We're working on that now. Order by on join is currently being worked on and will be released first, with group by on join following in a later release. In addition to being useful for developers generally, these are both important new capabilities that will allow us to further enhance the Harmony Core framework. As you can imagine, working with data in ISAM files while performing operations like join, order by, and group by can be challenging. So part of the solution that was designed involves creating in-memory temporary tables containing the data resulting from a complex query. These temp tables contain static data that is unaffected by operations that others may be performing on the files at the same time your complex queries are operating, and ensure consistency when iterating through your resulting dataset. But doing this may be useful in other scenarios. So we're planning on a new mechanism to allow you to obtain and iterate results from a temp table for any select query. As I alluded to earlier, we do plan on making Synergy.net under .NET 6 a supported deployment platform on Linux instances that support the .NET 6 runtime. This will be a huge advantage for anybody deploying Synergy applications on Linux, as they will have access to a wealth of additional capabilities provided by .NET, including the ability to implement multi-threaded applications. Support will be for service or console applications. There will be no support for any graphical UI. Linux will be a deployment platform. The Synergy.net compiler and other development tools will not be available there, at least initially. Development will be in Visual Studio on Windows, targeting and publishing the app for Linux deployment. Of course, there will be support for debugging the application running on Linux directly from Visual Studio, especially when your Linux instance runs under WSL2, or the Windows subsystem for Linux, which provides a truly awesome experience for Linux developers on Windows. Synergy.net support for Linux will come in two phases, initially supporting Harmony Core services, and later adding support for other applications in a subsequent release. This new platform is taking a little longer than we originally expected, but we are close to being able to release it now. As support for .NET 6 on Linux is a new platform, not a feature, we did originally intend to ship it as an update to the 12.1 LTS release, but unfortunately the required runtime code changes were more extensive than we originally thought, making it inappropriate to do so. We will be shipping it as a 12.2 feature release. This will be a big deal for Linux customers with Harmony Core services, who will have the option of moving their services from Windows to Linux close to their data. They will see improved performance, not that it's particularly bad today, and will no longer need to use XF Server to access their data. We have many plans for enhancements to our Visual Studio integration products, but I want to mention two in particular. We encourage all Synergy developers to work in Visual Studio and to keep the versions of both Visual Studio and SDI up to date. Customers frequently ask us to provide electronic notification when new versions of SDI become available, and we plan to implement that soon. Unfortunately, we won't be able to plug into Visual Studio's notifications window, so the solution will involve custom dialog, which pops up when opening a solution containing Synergy projects. The dialog will include information about the new SDI version, as well as a link to the release notes. And you will have the ability to prevent the dialog from being displayed from nagging you for a while. We're also planning to start collecting telemetry information that will be reported back to us to help us improve the product. This will not happen unless you opt in and provide permission, and you will have the ability to subsequently opt out. Initially, we plan to collect information in two categories. Firstly, information about product features that you use or don't use. This will help us focus our resources on the areas of the product set that are most important to our customers. Secondly, failures within the SDI product itself. By automatically receiving information about failures, we can be far more proactive in responding to issues, perhaps even fixing things before you even realize there's a problem. Another area that we intend to focus on is that of the raw performance of the Synergy compilers. But our motivation is not specifically to improve the time taken when you say build, although improvements there are always welcome. Our motivation is that in addition to when you click on build, the compilers are constantly being used in the background to analyze and detect the changes that you're making to the source code and that you're currently working on. This operation is referred to as a background compile or a minimal analyze. These operations drive the functionality that makes or breaks the developer experience in the IDE. Features like color coding, IntelliSense, code completion, error adorners or squigglies, go to definition, find references, and so much more. You're not the only ones that use SDI. We use it too, and we know that there are some things in the experience that could use some work. And at the root of many of these issues is the raw performance of the compiler. But it's not just about the compiler and the Synergy code in your solutions. In .NET projects in particular, you may have references to projects from other languages, and for sure we'll have references to other assemblies from the .NET framework and other sources such as NuGet packages. SDI also has to analyze all of those assemblies, and we think we may have a way to significantly improve the performance of that process also. I mentioned earlier that we would like to improve the developer's quality of life when doing repository-centric development, which so many of us do these days. Currently, we have a whole list of ideas, some of which will happen, some of which may not. We are working on prioritizing that list, and some of these are repository UI things, some are RPS util command line things, and some are Visual Studio integration things. The items on this slide are just a selection in no particular order of some of the items being considered. The Synergy data language is a language, and we would like to implement full fidelity schema file editing in Visual Studio for that language, with all the language sensitive features that you would expect. But doing so requires quite a considerable effort, and there are several ways to achieve it. More on that later. In addition to language sensitivity, we're also investigating adding snippets to help you at least insert template code that provides the minimum required keywords to define a new structure or field or key or file, and so on. For some time now, we've had the ability to load individual schema files, one for each structure and file and so on, and successfully load them into a repository, regardless of dependencies between them. But we don't currently have a way to export the repository back to those individual schema files. Developers must do that manually if they use the repository UI to make changes. We'd like to fix that. And if we have the ability to export to individual schema files, then we may be able to export schema files for things that have changed during a repository UI editing session. After all, repository already tracks the date of last change on things like structures and files. We're also considering adding the ability to specify what you want to edit as a command line option when launching the repository. And if we achieve that, then there's no reason why we can't have things like right-click context menu entries on structure schema files in Visual Studio and have the option to say open directly in repository UI for the item contained in that schema and so on. I know there's an elephant in the room. We'd all like to see an all-new modern UI for the repository that makes it easier to use, but the reality is that that would be a monumental effort to achieve, and we don't think it would be an effective use of our developer hours. We believe we can solve most of the problems through steps like the ones I just described, and in a fraction of the time. There is one other thing that I would like to mention, which is that if we do decide to implement full fidelity repository schema editing in Visual Studio, one option for doing so is by leveraging the language server protocol, known as LSP, and writing a language server for the Synergy data language. But doing so would be quite a learning process for sure. But having learned the process, there is the potential to then take advantage of that knowledge and write an LSP for DBL. Once you've created a language server for your language, support for that language can be added to any IDE that supports LSP. And there are many, including Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code, and even an upcoming version of SlickEdit, which is the IDE that underpins the Workbench environment, and many more. This could be a mechanism for achieving consistent high-fidelity language support across multiple IDEs and editors. But please understand that this is not something we are currently working on, and if we do ever decide to implement it, it will most likely be several versions out. We're also hoping to do some work to make it easier to operate DBL code in multi-threaded environments. For example, when calling existing older traditional Synergy code in .NET. Right now, as many of you will already know, there are several things in DBL that don't play too well in multi-threaded applications. These are not necessarily a problem, so long as you understand how things work and avoid doing certain things. Generally, these are things that in a multi-threaded environment operate at the process level, not the thread level. The issues are with things like channels, environment variables, global and common data, and so on. And also some routines like the %chopen and %synth3chan are also not safe to use in multi-threaded environments. While we don't have any way to completely address all of these things, we do think we can make things better in some of these areas. By adding a compiler warnings when you use non-thread safe routines, we can help you identify areas of concern, and in most cases there are simple alternative mechanisms that are easy to implement. And we think we can address the environment variable issue by introducing the concept of thread local environment variables within the runtime via a new parameter to xcall setlog. I'd like to briefly talk about our future plans for the Harmony Core framework, but again, as I mentioned earlier, my comments here will be very brief because Jeff Green has a presentation specifically on Harmony Core right after this one. Once the SDE team delivers their enhancements to the select order by and group by features, we are expecting to be able to take advantage of those features to enhance Harmony Core's OData capabilities. And there are also a couple of specific new features that we're planning that we already know several customers will be able to take advantage of. The first is the ability to, for want of a better term, glue two files together and make one composite record made up of individual records from both files. One example might be if you have a single logical record, but for some reason it's been split across two files. A second example might be if you had, for example, a corporate inventory file with generic information like SKUs and descriptions, and also location-specific inventory files containing quantity on hand, allocated, on order for a specific location. For this second scenario, you could already expose this as two related entities, but this feature would allow you to flatten the data into a single entity. Another scenario that we've encountered more than once now is when multiple long text fields, for example, freehand notes fields, are split up and stored across multiple records in a data file, but need to be glued together and presented as a single field when queried. We plan to address that scenario also. A subject that is part of regular conversations with many customers and so has become an important topic for the Synergex product team is that of cloud computing. Clearly, this is a very large subject area. The major cloud vendors such as Microsoft, Amazon, and Google now offer several hundred of individual products and services in some cases. We've been asking customers to share what cloud computing means to them and asking them to help us define things that we can do in Synergy to make their journey towards cloud computing easier. If you do have feedback in this area, we would really like to have a conversation with you, and sooner rather than later. For now, we're focused on the key topic of how one could go about running Synergy code and accessing Synergy data in the cloud, and how doing so could result in a robust and highly available computing platform. To be clear, we're not talking about using virtual machines and traditional clustering technologies here. Those solutions already exist and have for some time. No, we're talking about using newer technologies such as containerization and microservices and products such as Docker and Kubernetes. If you attended Kelsey Hightower's keynote presentation yesterday, you probably already realized that this is a significant area of focus for us. And as you will have seen, we already have several working examples using both of these technologies as a way to propel Synergy applications forward into the next generation of computing platforms. And you will see more examples later in the conference. I'll wrap up on this presentation by telling you that the process improvements and modernization that we've been working on for the last couple of years are ongoing, but as I mentioned earlier, it's fair to say that we're nearing the end of that process now. We just have a few more things to work on. In particular, our teams are currently working on some improvements in the support process, specifically related to improving notifications that occur between development and support as the development team work on customer issues. This will result in improved notifications to customers when things like the status of their trackers that developments have been working on changes. And of course, the product team also continues to work on researching products and decision-making with regard to the future enhancement of our products. In this session, you've heard about some of our plans, but there will be more exciting things to come as we get closer to defining the full feature set for the 12.3 LTS release. But the good news is you won't have to wait for that long to start experiencing some of those planned new features, as they will be first introduced through a series of 12.2 feature releases, and that process should begin soon. Thank you all for joining this presentation. I hope you found it useful and interesting, and at this point I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have.
All right, thank you, Steve. It's time now for the Q&A portion of the presentation. If you guys have any questions, there's a raised hand icon at the bottom of the chat, so you can raise your hand to have your microphones enabled. If you don't see the icon at the bottom, you can go ahead and feel free to post your questions into the chat or the Q&A section of the chat.
In the meantime, I guess we could review some of the questions that have already been entered in there in case people haven't seen them while people type. Louis asked, is TLS 1.3 supported for encryption? And the answer is yes, TLS 1.3 is now supported in the latest versions of Synergy. From memory, I believe we still default to TLS 1.2, but you can configure your systems to use TLS 1.3 if your operating system supports it. Stuart had a question about Linux license forwarding and wanted to know whether a Linux runtime version 12 can forward licenses to a Windows Synergy 11 license server. And the answer to that one is yes, as long as that Windows license server is using Rev 11 licensing, then that can happen. And Gordon wanted some information on any upcoming language awareness for editing repository schemas, and hopefully that was answered during the session. Who supports Harmony Core? Will it remain with the dev team, or can we log issues and queries with support? Gordon, that's something that we are working on right now. We do have plans to introduce formal support offerings for Harmony Core environments at various levels. That's something that Rachel Gibson owns right now. I would suggest you speak to Rachel, and we can certainly have a conversation about that. But long story short is yes, we are planning on introducing formal support mechanisms for Harmony Core.
Hello, Mr. Hive. Always a pleasure talking with you. Can you hear me?
Thank you, Louis. How are you?
Yep.
I was working on something this morning, and it was reporting to licensing. Right now, we need to, for the new paradigm on license, we need a Windows server. Do Synergex plan to have this feature on Unix to be the license server?
I do not believe there are any plans to do that right now, Louis. We can certainly have a conversation about it, but no, the answer is no at this time.
Says, are there any performance issues when implementing ISAM resilience?
Okay, Paul, the answer to that is maybe. It depends. Implementing resilient ISAM, no, there are no particular performance implementation, impacts on doing so. Obviously, until such time as if any recovery is needed, then clearly there can be an impact on performance as that very expensive recovery operation takes place in real time. So you might expect a slowdown. If you enable full resilient, then yes, there will be a performance impact because those caches have to be flushed all the way through to disk. So there certainly will be an expected impact of that. Okay, Nadeem, we have a DBL RTL libraries. We faced a problem calling it from our .NET project. We can write out raw DBL code. Can we add our RTL libraries to the project? I'm not fully clear. I think it sounds like you're trying to call existing formerly traditional Synergy code from .NET. That certainly is something that you can do, Nadeem, but it depends on the structure of that code. As soon as you drop something into a .NET project, there are a small number of things that might work differently or may not be supported in the .NET product, although there's not many of those. But you do immediately put yourself into a fully prototyped environment as soon as you do that as well. So in most cases, there's a little bit of work to do to get existing traditional Synergy code working in .NET, but it's absolutely doable.
Oh, one last question from David Zinnick here. When using the Synergy print subroutines, I'm able to put JPEGs in my reports. Is there a way to do this in traditional Synergy and Visual Studio?
David, it's a long time since I looked at the Windows Print API. I believe the answer is yes, but I cannot quote
I cannot state that 100%. Can you maybe log a support call with that, and we'll get you an absolute answer to that question? I think the answer is yes, but I'm not 100%.
Thank you, everyone, for joining this presentation. Please stick around. In a couple of minutes, our next presentation is going to start with our CTO, Jeff Green, which is going to be a web services and Harmony Core update. So thank you again, everyone, for joining, and we'll see you at the next session.